Hi, I'm Dr. Robert Cohen. Today, I'm going to talk to you about math mistakes on the SAT. So, it's so easy to make these types of mistakes on the test, and they can cost you a lot of points. On one test, for example, the first test of the Blue Book, let's say, hypothetically, that you knew how to solve all the math problems. You only miss one question because you can't solve it. Okay, great. You've scored an 800. But now, imagine that you also made two mistakes on the math portion. So now you've missed three questions. This is a completely probable thing that you would miss two or more questions. This is a pretty regular occurrence. Okay, so now your 800 has dropped because of two avoidable mistakes to a 730. That's a 70-point drop in your score because of two little mistakes. That's enormous. It makes sense that this would happen, and it does happen so often because you're trying to finish 54 questions in 70 minutes. You're trying to work quickly. You're in a high-pressure situation. I mean, it's easy enough to make mistakes in math. When you're not taking the SAT, there's plenty of room for calculation errors, labeling mistakes. But then when you add in the fact that the test is timed, it's high-pressured, and the test makers are often trying to trick you and hide important details that you need to know, well, it's no wonder that mistakes happen so frequently, and are so easy to make. But don't despair. There's a lot you can do to minimize, if not altogether reduce, the mistakes that you make on the math portion of the test. So today I'm going to talk to you about 7 specific practices that you can do to minimize mistakes on the test. So the first thing that you can do to minimize mistakes is to, as soon as you start reading the question, underline important pieces of information in the question. So what's important? Anything, practically, they're giving you that variables, values, rules and conditions, inequalities, relationships, anything specific in the question stem, you want to be underlining. This is so that you don't forget about important pieces of information, which it's easy to do. And it's also to get you focusing on the details of the question and thinking critically about those details as soon as you start reading the problems. It's a way to help get your brain in high gear, in addition to help you avoid missing key pieces of information. To this end, always underline each piece of information separately. For example, if you're told that the answer choice is going to be a positive integer, underline positive, then separately underline integer. If you don't do this, it's really easy to overlook one of the two conditions and to say, okay, I'm looking for an integer answer, or I'm looking for a positive answer, rather than looking for an answer that satisfies both conditions. The test makers like to try and sneak a condition by you by burying it in a chain like this, where they lump together 2 or 3 different conditions into one, hoping you might pass over quickly one of the conditions when you're reading the questions. So underline every piece of information they're giving you, and underline what are really separate pieces of information separately, even if the test makers seem to be lumping them together. The second rule is to always write down your work. It's really tempting to try and solve the problem or parts of the problem in your head. It can save time. Maybe it's easy to do, you like doing it, but don't do this. Make sure to write everything out. Write each step out legibly, and write it clearly and in the order in which you perform the steps. This is important because not only will it help you reduce errors you might make if you were doing the calculation in your head, but if you get to the end of the problem and you realize you don't have the right answer, it's really easy to quickly go back and see where you may have made a mistake. And this holds true too for if you reach the end of the test and you have time left over. At that point, you're going to go back and check your work. And this is a really clear and easy way to check the work you've done. The third rule is to not be afraid of using your calculator. You may often want to avoid the calculator in order to save time by doing the math in your head, but it's really easy to make mistakes that way. And the calculator doesn't actually take much time. It can often take a second or less if you're using it very, very efficiently and quickly. So make sure to really use the calculator to avoid mistakes. You can do very basic calculations in your head, like 3 times 3 is 9, but if you find that you're making mistakes on these calculations, which it's not hard to do given in a timed high pressured environment, then go ahead and do these calculations in the calculator. Okay, fourth, whenever you have a geometry problem, make sure to thoroughly label the figure, label all values on the figure, even if this involves some repetition. So for example, you may have a rectangle, and you may have labeled one side of the rectangle as 7. You may say, I don't need to label the opposite side as 7 because it's a rectangle. Clearly, the values of the opposite sides are the same. They both have a length of 7. Why would I write 7 on the other side? But the truth is that geometrical figures often become very complicated on SAT problems. You may have to break that rectangle down into a couple of other rectangles or triangles. And then it's very easy, if you have not thoroughly labeled each length, each angle, it's very easy to miss something and to make a mistake. So even if you find that you're repeating yourself somewhat, always make sure to thoroughly label all the values in a geometric figure. The fifth rule also involves geometric figures. So if there's an alternative figure that you can draw that's different from the one they're showing you, draw that figure out. Oftentimes, they'll give you a set of conditions in the question stem, and then they'll show you an image of the figure they're describing. But often, it's not the only representation of the conditions they're giving you, and there's a second or third way to draw the triangle that they're telling you about. That's different than the triangle they're showing you. And often, unsurprisingly, the correct answer is hidden in the second or third iteration of the geometrical figure. So make sure that you say to yourself, is there a different way I could draw this figure based on these rules? And if so, make sure to draw that out, because that's how you might find your right answer in some questions. The sixth rule is that you want to always go back and check your work once you get to the end of the section. You may not have time to do this, but as you practice more, do more questions, get more comfortable with the test, you should be able to finish the section more quickly, and the ultimate goal, if possible, is to be able to finish the section with time left over to go back and review your work. Now, when you do this, you want to review your work starting with the last question in the section and work backward from there all the way to the first question. This is because you want to make sure you have time to review those final questions in the section, because they're more difficult. They often involve more calculations, so there's more room to make an error in your work, and they also have more hidden tricks and rules, and it can be very easy to miss something that's pretty simple. So since it's a lot easier to make a mistake on those problems, if you have time at the end of the section, you want to make sure you devote it first to reviewing those problems. The seventh and final rule is to make sure that you make note of the questions that you've made a mistake on, and that you go back and review them later. It's really easy to not do this, to say, well, I missed this question because I wrote 2 + 2 = 5 instead of 4, and I'm not going to make that mistake again. The question's easy. But we often make the same sorts of mistakes again, and so by noting what mistakes we're making, So not only noting, the question you missed, but noting what mistake you made on that question, you can start to discern your patterns in making mistakes, and you'll be able to cut down on those. You'll know what mistakes you're prone to make, and you'll be less likely to make those mistakes in the future. So in summary, mistakes in SAT math can cost you a lot of points. Make sure to use these 7 strategies as you practice for the test to help cut down on those mistakes and to save yourself valuable points.